The coronavirus pandemic has had an immense impact on the way that British people work. I think few anticipated that we would adapt as quickly as we had. Estimates prior to the pandemic were that around 15% of workers could work productively from home. At one point in 2020, close to half of people were working from home to varying degrees of productivity. So thanks to technological innovation, thanks to the adaptability of both businesses and workers, I think coronavirus has had a very large impact. The question remains how long lasting that impact will be, whether we will revert to the working practices that were in place prior to the pandemic. That remains to be seen. What little evidence we do have suggests that many workers do prefer to be in the office. They like the water cooler conversations, they like the frisson of being around their colleagues, and likewise businesses have quite mixed opinions towards working from home, right to disconnect, a 4-day working week, all of some of these new working practices that are being floated and campaigned for. At the moment, there are a lot of companies that will have benefited from lower overheads during the pandemic, be it through rent or heating costs, but likewise there are many employers who believe that their workers are more productive when they're in the office. So there's huge divergence of opinion, I think, among employees, but also among employers. So there have been increasing calls from opposition parties, from trade unions, from campaign groups for government to mandate hybrid working or to mandate a right to disconnect or even to mandate 4-day working week. This would come with myriad unintended consequences, and these really ought to be considered before government takes any further steps towards increasing the amount of labour market regulation that's in place. And let's not forget that already our labour market is pretty heavily regulated. Successive governments over the last couple of decades or so have massively increased the amount of regulation that employers need to adhere to. The number of jobs that require an occupational licence has increased from 1 in 20 to 1 in 5. Government is controlling the pay of large swathes of the workforce. It has a say in sick pay, maternity pay, the list just goes on and on. In Belgium, they have introduced this new labour market regulation that includes a 4-day working week. What we should bear in mind is that their labour market is already massively regulated, and that has a role to play in the fact that the employment rate in Belgium is about 10 percentage points lower than it is here in the UK. So we can see how labour market regulation may disincentivise job creation. It can benefit those who are already in work but punish those who are looking for work. It places additional burdens on businesses. These are businesses that have been through the mill over the last couple of years and really need the room for manoeuvre to grow and to take on new workers. But nonetheless, these regulations do seem to be quite popular, and it's not surprising that they are getting public support. Who doesn't like the idea of condensing 5 days work into 4 days? Who doesn't like the idea of switching off their computer at 5 p.m. in the evening and not having to switch it back on again until 9 a.m. the following morning, or to not have their employer contacting them between those hours? But the problem with a 4-day working week, for instance, is that you will see some people getting additional jobs on that 5th day, finding other ways to upskill. I imagine that this could penalise women in the workplace who would really benefit from having a 4-day working week but wouldn't be able to work that 5th day if they've got childcare responsibilities. Likewise, a right to disconnect may sound appealing, but we've all come to value additional flexibility over the course of this pandemic, and I imagine that most employers, if they're only allowed to contact you between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m, won't be too pleased about you surfing the web or popping to the post office during those working hours. So these are all things that need to be considered, and yet early indications are that the government will succumb to some of the pressure for additional workers' rights or new working practices. Already it's introduced a right to request flexible working on day one, which really shifts the burden onto the employer. They are going to need to justify why they are turning down any of these requests, and you can very quickly imagine how compliance teams will get nervous that they'll be hauled up in front of the employment tribunal if they do turn down a request by, say, a working mother to condense her days into 4, to work from home so that she's able to do the school run, and so on and so forth. So we need to tread extremely carefully when it comes to introducing yet more labour market regulation, and it would be far better to give businesses room for manoeuvre, the freedom to grow, and for the many hundreds of thousands of voluntary arrangements between employers and employees that are already in place to continue. Well, it's very difficult to say at this stage, but you can see how it may create all sorts of perverse incentives. If employers are worried that some of their employees are going to request flexible working after the birth of their child, then they may be less incentivized to hire women into more junior roles when they're in their 20s. We've seen lots of unintended consequences from the gender pay gap reporting legislation that came in a few years ago, where essentially companies were disincentivized from taking on more junior women because that skewed the data and made them look as though they had very wide gender pay gaps. And you could imagine similar issues occurring were we to implement 4-day working weeks or flexible working if it doesn't suit the employer, or indeed a right to disconnect. With the increase in national insurance contributions, which of course includes employer national insurance contributions from April this year, and the planned increase in corporation tax next year, plus this idea that's really gathered steam over the course of the pandemic that businesses exist to create jobs and to create jobs that afford their workers a certain lifestyle, you start to wonder why anybody in Britain today would want to be an employer, why anybody would want to be a business owner taking on new workers, because the mentality seems to have shifted so far in the direction of the employee. Of course, we want to have a society in which workers are able to approach their employers and try to negotiate working practices that are beneficial to them, and the jury is still out on whether working from home does indeed boost productivity, but there is some indication to suggest that it does. So it's an extremely nuanced debate, and what we don't need is for the government to come in with one-size-fits-all regulation that may not benefit all employers and certainly may not benefit all employees.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.